Bruce.
Okay. Okay, another real number.
7.
Okay, 7. When I add two real numbers together, am I going to get a real or an imaginary number as an answer?
Real.
Good job. Okay, so a real plus a real stays real.
I'm a real.
Okay, give me an example of an imaginary number. I. Give me an example of another imaginary number. 2i. Okay, so if I add those two imaginary numbers together, I was actually just looking if I is on the calculator.
On mine, it's like the bottom where the dot is.
Oh, yeah, it is right there. There is an I on there. That's cool. Okay, so does my answer to that still have an I in it? Is it real or imaginary? Good. So an I plus I is still I. Imaginary. Okay. What happens when we add a real number? Okay, how about -3 plus an imaginary number? Remember, i's are imaginary, but also square roots and negative. So let's look at the square root of -5. So here's a real plus an imaginary number. Okay, so what I want to know is if my answer is going to be real or imaginary. Wait for it. Oh, no. So what is it? Says error, so that means I know it's still imaginary, right? So a real number plus an imaginary number is imaginary. Good? Okay, I know it's boring, but it's easy. Let's get through it. We're doing great. Okay, let's go to number 9. So I want to do some examples of this. Yeah, so is the square root of -9 an R or an I? Is it real or imaginary? Good. So that's an I plus another I. Imaginary plus imaginary, right? So is my answer imaginary or real? Imaginary. An I plus an I is still an I. Good? Yeah. Okay, on 11, is the first one an imaginary or a real number?
Are you supposed to solve it first?
Nope.
So it's imaginary.
Okay. And then what about the second one? Square root of 9, is that real or imaginary? It's real.
That's not a negative.
Yep. It's a positive 9, good. So then is my final answer going to be real or imaginary? There you go. You guys are getting the hang of it.
Miss, what's your favorite number?
42.
42?
Yep.
Why 42?
So you got 40.
Because in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, isn't that the answer to the universe, 42? Or is it 43?
No,
It's
it's 40.
42. Yeah.
The answer to what?
The answer to everything in the universe is 42.
So I got this thing on my hand because of the number 42.
Yep. Okay. Number 4.
Nah, 42.
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is actually a really funny book. If you haven't read it, you should read it.
Can we answer all these and put 42? 42.
No. But that's a good thought, though. I know. Okay, yeah. Okay. Touche, Jose. Touche, okay? Okay, what happens when we multiply two real numbers? So if I do 5 times -2, that's a real number times a real number, right? So I want to know, is my answer going to be real or imaginary?
42.
Real, 42. All right, you got me in that one. Okay, two real numbers multiplied to stays real. Good. Okay.
Is this the thing where it's like negative two imaginaries make up?
It does. Okay, so look, this is where it gets a little weird. We learned a property last class that said if I have, okay, we learned a property last class that if I have two square roots like this that are separate, do you guys remember this property? I had you circle it. The square root of A times the square root of B equals the square root of A times B, right? Remember doing that? So that means if I have this, which is an I, right? A square root of a negative times a square root of a negative, right? So this is an imaginary times an imaginary. You guys agree with that?
Yeah.
But using our rule from last time, what happens when I do negative 5 times negative 2? What does that become?
Miss, you got an eraser?
Yeah, over there, there's 4 big ones. What do you guys think? What happens when I do negative 5 times negative 2? Negative 10? Yeah, because 2 negatives make a positive. So here's the weird thing. When I multiply 2 imaginary numbers together, I don't get an imaginary answer, right? I get a real answer.
So what are positives though? It's still imaginary enough.
If they're positives, then they're not 2 imaginary numbers being multiplied together, right? Okay, so, but what if I had on this one, if I have a real number, so that's a positive square root, times an imaginary number, so a negative square root. When I multiply those together, 5 times negative 2, is that equal the square root of 10 or the square root of negative 10? So a real number times an imaginary number gives me an imaginary number. So 2 reals multiplied together is a real. 2 imaginaries multiplied together is a real. And then a real times an imaginary is an imaginary. Good? Okay, so let's try the examples. So on number 10, that one is an imaginary number times a real number. So is my answer imaginary or real? We're on number 10 now. So I have an imaginary times a real. So is my answer imaginary or real?
Imaginary.
Imaginary, good. And then last one, I have an imaginary times an imaginary. So it's a real number. Good. Yeah, what's up?